diesem Tagesordnungspunkt.
Now, for this particular agenda point, I would like to welcome the Commission.
Es folgt nun die Erklärung.
So first of all, Commission statement on rising precariousness in Europe and the need for aid for the most deprived within the European Union. And I'd like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Nicolas Schmid, Commissioner. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, first, I would like to thank the Parliament for scheduling this timely debate. Indeed, it is important to start this session with a debate on a crucial problem millions of citizens are daily confronted with. The overall economic prospects are challenging following the impact of the COVID pandemic, the energy crisis, and finally, the inflation hikes. In general terms, indicators on risks of poverty and social exclusion have remained overall stable over the past few years. But, as so often, statistics do not tell the whole story. Inflation hits particularly vulnerable households and lower medium income families. Indeed, it is also true that income support measures put in place have mitigated the impact of high energy prices and inflation. And therefore, we can acknowledge some positive impact of the exceptional and temporary measures adopted both at EU and Member States level. But poverty remains acute in Europe, and citizens are quite rightly concerned. To have a serious impact, more structural measures are needed to address poverty and precarious living and working conditions. In-work poverty is also a persisting challenge in the EU, especially for people in non-standard forms of employment, among them many young people and many women, and for non-EU citizens. Under the Porto Declaration, EU leaders committed to reducing inequalities and ensuring fair wages, fighting social exclusion and tackling poverty, taking on, in particular, the objective of fighting child poverty. While we observe encouraging data on employment, we register little progress towards the goal of poverty reduction and social inclusion. The social and economic effects of the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and subsequent cost of living crisis have amplified existing social inequalities. A rising number of families across Europe have begun to fall into food poverty and are increasingly reliant on food banks and similar services to meet basic needs. And here I underline the importance of the FEAD program, which can help or at least contribute to lower the needs of these families, of these people. And I appeal to Member States to use the money, the remaining money which is in FEAD still available, to use it to alleviate these needs. The effects of the cost of living, including the cost of housing, are felt unevenly across society. Lower income groups and vulnerable citizens have been most affected, of course. It is the moment to step up our efforts towards achieving our target of reducing by 2030 the number of persons at risk of poverty or social exclusion in the EU by at least 15 million, of which at least 5 million should be children. We must live up to our commitments. Strong and efficient welfare systems, adequate provision and take-up of social services are necessary to fight poverty and ensure social cohesion. We must address the root causes of poverty, break the cycle of disadvantage and address the new challenges. In this context, it is critical that governments assess the distributional effects of their policies, investments and reforms on the most vulnerable. Tackling poverty and social exclusion is at the centre of the European Pillar of Social Rights and its action plan, and a number of key steps have been taken at the EU level. The European Child Guarantee, which guarantees access to key services for children in need. Member States have to allocate a certain percentage of their ESF plus money to its implementation, which amounts to approximately 9 billion euros. The directive on adequate minimum wages, ensuring workers can afford a decent standard of living. And here I noticed that in many member states, minimum wages have been increased before even the transposition of the directive. The Council recommendation on adequate minimum income, ensuring active inclusion. In some member states, minimum income has been adjusted, unfortunately, not in all, and even the contrary has happened. The European Platform on Combating Homelessness, we will have another opportunity to discuss the housing crisis that hits millions of Europeans. Adequate financial resources and policies are needed at national and European level. We support and complement Member States' action through the European semester and EU funding, such as via the Fund for European Aid to the Most Deprived, with 4.6 billion earmarked to address material deprivation, the European Social Fund Plus with an investment in support to social inclusion of 45.5 billion, and 5.5 billion for material support to the most deprived for the period 21-27. And under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, 28% have been allocated to social investments. To effectively tackle the root causes of poverty, social policies must go hand in hand with economic and fiscal policies, as well as more inclusive and fair labour markets, aiming at upward social and economic convergence. I also want to mention Repower EU, that can contribute to combat energy poverty, as well as the EU Social Climate Fund, that should compensate those families most impacted by price increases. So many actions have been put into place at EU level as well as on Member States level. But the situation remains extremely worrisome. Therefore, we cannot take our foot off the accelerator. Obviously, we have to combat more effectively unjustified price increases that fuel inflation, and at the same time, vulnerable households need further support, even if this support has to be more targeted. Precariousness, poverty and social exclusion should have no place in our European Union. Therefore, combating them should be our common priority. Thank you.
Herr Kommissar, thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Wir kommen zu unserer nächsten Rednerin.
Now we come to our next speaker, Madam Cindy Franson.
Commissaris, collega's.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, colleagues, poverty and social exclusion affect 95 million European citizens, and 25 million of those are children. The costs of living have risen exponentially. Energy costs are extremely high. Rent is through the roof, and many people simply can't afford a home over their heads, and they simply can't make ends meet. This is becoming an increasing problem. More and more people are resorting to food banks. More and more people are in need of the support, and there's less and less available. Inflation is about 30% in some areas, and financial support from ESF Plus is simply woefully inadequate. We need to increase the finance we have available in these programmes because people are in such desperate need. The lights are all flash red, extremely red, and it's our moral duty to be protecting and helping the most vulnerable people. Much more is necessary. We need to have a much greater measure of ambition. We talked about removing people from poverty in huge numbers in the context of the SDGs, for example, but we have simply failed to do this. So our next legislature has got to have much more stringent targets and has got to achieve them. We can't simply keep putting on the back burner this issue of tackling poverty and social exclusion. So much more has got to be done in terms of social policy and supporting our citizens who are in dire need. Thank you.
Frau Kollegin, ich erteile Herrn Pedro Marques.
Thank you very much. Pedro Marques now has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, dear Commissioner Nicolas Schmit, colleagues. Dear Commissioner, in the State of the Union, President von der Leyen failed to address the struggle of European families. No red heart, no social commitment at that moment from her. And we are still so far from the Porto social objectives, namely on poverty. And that is why that silence was so concerning. I am glad that you brought energy and that you broke that silence today in the name of the Commission. Because the war triggered the cost of living crisis. Many families, as it was just said, they cannot even make ends meet, even if they are fully employed. Housing costs are skyrocketing for those families and particularly for the youngsters. Anyone that loses their job at this stage, or even anyone who chooses to divorce, they face enormous risks at this stage. For women, as always, the risks are even more acute. The EU must deliver on the Porto agenda, with more ESF, more RRF funds to the most excluding, putting pressure from the Commission to the Member States to prioritise social housing on their recovery plans, like a progressive government did in Portugal. Finding the resources for the child guarantee, finally finding the resources for the child guarantee from the Commission for the poverty goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Vedrine Marie-Pierre, the floor.
Madame Marie-Pierre Vedrin.
Thank you. In all of our member states and in my country, France, associations are overwhelmed. There are fewer donations and yet demand is on the increase and winter is coming. And yet we live in one of the richest regions of the world. Millions of our fellow citizens are currently fighting for their survival. They can't get a hot meal. They can't get healthcare. There's the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, also food prices have skyrocketed. All of this makes it very difficult to make ends meet. We can't be a union of values if we allow this injustice to continue. We need to reduce poverty. That's what we said at the Porto Summit, Commissioner. That is the right target. Commission and Council need to step up the pace now. We need to act as Europeans in order to get tangible results. We need to make sure that we use the funds that are available to us and we need to feed them. And, of course, we need to fight all forms of poverty, especially extreme poverty. A new summit would be required. There won't be a reduction in poverty if we don't have measures to counter galloping inflation. We need to deal with debt, ecological issues. We know that there are solutions out there. We also know it's not easy, but I would like to pay tribute to Sylvie Brunet, my colleague, who can't be here. But a Europe based on social values, on solidarity, that is the cause that we should all be fighting for. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Monier Sartori.
Thank you, Mr. Munir Sartori. Thank you very much, President. Colleagues. Thank you, Commissioner Schmit. Statistics can never give us the real picture, the full picture of all the suffering and the terrible situation of mounting difficulties which many of our citizens are finding they are facing on a daily basis. And therefore, we need to have a coherent strategy vis-à-vis the member states. I'm sorry that Mr. Séjourné is not here because it was Renew that proposed we have this item on the agenda. And I would have liked to congratulate him on his sense of timing, because this is a debate which is taking place at a time when Emmanuel Macron and his presidential majority, of course Renew represents that, are actually facing difficulties in trying to force more people to go to work for 15 hours a week in order to get a minimum wage, which is way below the poverty level. So we need to have a coherent policy, and we need to take some action. We're told, for example, that 35% of the population can't even eat 3 meals a day. And there are far too many who are facing huge problems in accessing any kind of support. There are many, many difficulties in providing for the amount of support for food banks which is necessary. And we've really got to mobilise. And this is why Europe has got to mobilise all the resources it has to good end. For example, we have got the good fortune of having some payments which can be made available under European policy, but we can't be substituting solidarity with charity, because we've got to remember human dignity is of the essence. It's absolutely paramount here, and therefore it's a question of looking at how we can deal with food security, how we can provide better support for food distribution and food assistance. After all, winter is round the corner and the situation will only deteriorate still further. Thank you.
Ms. Rafalska Elizabeth Pieta, you are the next one.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Komisarzu.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, in Europe, one crisis seems to be leading to another, and of course, it is those most in need, the most deprived, who suffer greatest under these circumstances. 73 million Europeans are threatened by poverty. 1 in 4 children, 39% of children in mid-income and low-income families are suffering. In my country, in Poland, a country which has been unjustly attacked repeatedly in this chamber, we have a totally different situation. We have security on the labor market. We have support for those unemployed. We have less poverty. One of the most important indices, all those indices that tell us about, for example, child poverty, education level, and so on and so forth, those indices are all much higher in Poland. Policies for people in difficult situations, for those who have been deprived because of different conditions, either because they're children or older people, they are protected by the Polish state. We have a robust state system which supports these individuals. So perhaps you ought to look at the example that we have to provide. Our next speaker is Rossana Conte.
La recente crisi energetica.
Thank you. The recent energy crisis and escalating inflation have had a very adverse impact on our families throughout Europe, not just the most vulnerable. 1 family in 3 is struggling to make ends meet. And in Italy, this figure approximates to 1 in 2. This is a terrible scourge across our society, and more people are feeling marginalized and excluded, especially people who have short-time or seasonal contracts, 0 hours contracts working in agriculture, fishing, tourism and building. These people have only got part-time work. They're working in certain seasons when needed, and therefore they're living in a terribly unstable situation. They don't know where they'll get their next job from, and therefore they are resorting to having to take on loans. The situation for people marginalised in this way and on the periphery of society is ever worse. They're getting no protection, and so we need to protect their rights, protect their work, and ensure that they get the support that they need. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsieur Mark Potenga.
Thank you very much. Mark Potenga, please. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. I think really you're not seeing the wood for the trees. We have a social emergency today in Europe. It's awful. In Belgium, a quarter of parents can't actually feed their children properly. 3/4 of teachers have already seen children who are starving at school. Students can't find student residences, housing. And if today, as a worker, you want to take public transport, well, you know, delays, trains that are cancelled, and don't fall ill, whatever you do, because hospitals are understaffed and they don't have the equipment they need. If you happen to be reaching retirement age, well, your legal pension will probably not be sufficient to guarantee or to cover what you need, for instance, for a home. But what you're also not talking about is the consequences of European policy here. Liberalisation, austerity, which you imposed, and the worst, and let's be honest here, when it comes to workers are facing such a hard time. What the Commission is suggesting is coming back with the budgetary pact, with cuts into public services. That's the worst, and that's absolutely unacceptable. We're going to fight it.
Danke. Unser nächster Redner ist.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Nicolaou Alavanos. Statements made by the Austrian Chancellor basically implying if they have no bread, let them eat cake. This displays the deeply anti-popular, anti-social strategy of minimum rights espoused by bourgeois governments in the EU, making cuts in benefits to support the poor. In Greece, poverty coupons were only given to the victims of flood. The problems continue. There is that cycle of profit. We have the workday being undermined, now 13 hours in Greece. Subsidies and support for consortia pushing for green and digital transition. This has boosted inflation. We have energy poverty, interest rate hikes, all resulting in households in need losing their very homes in the end. So yesterday they were called vulnerable, now they're called deprived. But there's been no change in strategy. Precariousness still exists, housing issues, poverty, and really only if these classes organize will they be able to overcome this scourge.
The floor is yours.
$95,3
90 million. Those are the numbers in the European Union, the number of people that are threatened by poverty in 2022, by social exclusion. 1 in 4 citizens of the European Union is under threat. But the terrible issue is that this particular figure has not dropped over the last couple of years. It has remained the same. This undermines social cohesion, and it also may undermine the European experiment, the European construct that we have, that we all support. We need to provide support to those that are in need, and that's why I'm glad that governments, like the government of Kyriakos Mitsotakis, are doing just that. The government of Mr. Konstantinos Mitsotakis has increased the minimum wage, adopted specific targeted measures to support the deprived. There's also the racial component as well, and the gender component. Women and young people are under greater threat. So we have to boost small and middle-sized enterprises, the very pillars of our economies. We have to provide for them as well, and we need to make something that will we have to create an environment, basically, that will support these types of enterprises, support jobs, creation of jobs, and maintenance of jobs, sustainable jobs. And for all of this, we have to be certain that the member states will implement the legislative measures that have been adopted, the new legislation that's out there right now to provide those living in precarious situations, those that are deprived. We need a true European social union which provides for all and which provides for social cohesion. That is the road that we have to follow. That is the trajectory that will lead to European cohesion and unity. Thank you.
Madame Fabienne Keller, the floor is yours. Excuse me. I have one colleague before, Madame Agnes Jongerius.
Voorzitter.
Thank you very much. More and more people are falling through the net. They can't pay their bills. They're having to resort to food banks, and they're facing huge problems. They have absolutely no way they can replace their washing machine, for example, if it breaks down, and that even people who are working full time. So it is high time that we actually implemented the minimum wage directive. Everybody's entitled to a minimum wage on which they can live and which takes into account inflation levels. But we need much more. We need adequate minimum wages. Yes, we need legislation on that. But the reality is when half of your income is going to go at least on actually paying for your house and affording any heating for that house, then you have a serious problem. And this is a case not only in Amsterdam or in Utrecht, it's the case everywhere. So many people can't afford a house in the first place, and if they even have one, they can't afford to heat it. And winter is around the corner. So what does the Commission intend to do to make life more affordable? Thank you.
Frau Kollegin, nun ist Frau Fabienne Keller.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Fabienne Keller.
Monsieur le Président.
President, dear Ottmar Karas, Commissioner, dear Nicola Schmidt, dear colleagues, you've already said it. Around Europe as a whole, our most vulnerable fellow citizens are in difficulty. Associations who help the most deprived in France, I'm thinking of food banks, I'm thinking of the Restaurant du Cœur, they're calling out the fact that there's an increasing number of people who depend on them. They're also saying how difficult it is for them to keep services going because of price rises. That's true for instance, the premises where they host the most vulnerable, heating costs, and it's also, of course, a consequence of COVID. As you said, Commissioner, the budget of the European Union has a target, namely 4% of the European Social Fund resources should be set aside for food aid and basic health for the most deprived. Shouldn't we perhaps update that target, make it a bit more ambitious in order to help the really most vulnerable? And how can we incentivize member states to do more, to be more ambitious? You talked about the fact that we should use our funds in order to help the most deprived. I know, of course, because I'm rapporteur for the budget, that the margins are tight, but, Commissioner, solidarity has to be a priority for us all. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Sarah Mathieu.
Voorzitter, beste commissaris.
Thank you very much indeed, President. Commissioner, you have made a statement on increasing poverty in Europe, and frankly, we needed this a long time ago. It's not 1 minute too soon. In her State of the Union address, unfortunately, President von der Leyen didn't even devote a millisecond to this, and that despite the percentage of people living in poverty in Europe, the number of people who are homeless, and the burgeoning spectre of poverty, which is causing uncertainty and fear throughout Europe. So tackling poverty is actually the top priority for our citizens. That's what they need us to do. If you look at the Eurobarometer publication, anyway, not so long ago, the European social pillar was adopted. But frankly, this Parliament is always arguing the case that we need to do more to bring people out of poverty. And right now, we are more than ever in dire need of these proposals to help people to escape from poverty. What about the in-work poor? Well, there are even more of those. There is no transition from in-work poverty to in-work keeping your head above the parapet. It's just not possible anymore, and we need some proper social policy. Thank you.
Herr Hoogeveen, the floor is yours.
Voorzitter, de koopkracht.
Thank you very much indeed. The purchasing power of every European is under pressure. The recent Eurobarometer studies have shown that more than half of Europeans feel that their purchasing power has declined considerably over the past 3 years. Now, that's actually a very shockingly high percentage. So this fall in purchasing power is clearly due to the escalating inflation. But it is also due to more than that. It's not just the war in Ukraine. It's not just due to COVID, and it's not just due to those who have been benefiting from that. It's also due to the lack of energy transition, and that's partly why our energy prices are escalating. And it's all very well to talk about security of existence, but we're going to have to do something to make people's lives less insecure. And that means we're going to have to make it less bureaucratic. We're going to have to address the issues that we have. We're going to have to tackle inflation, and we're going to have to try to do something rapidly to make sure that our taxpayers can actually make ends meet at last. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Madame Dominique Bilde.
Président, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. The European Union is asking French citizens to welcome everyone from around the world, all the poor, all the deprived. And yet in Brussels, technocrats, disconnected from reality, are failing to see how hard times are for our citizens. Our systems are at the end of their tether. We don't have money. You're saying, give money to migrants. French people can't actually heat their homes. We're providing healthcare to foreigners. A majority of our own nationals aren't going to the doctor because they don't have the means. You're also talking about regularising illegal migrants and at the same time preventing our nationals from living in their own country. I think we should defend our own before we defend others. It's a very simple solution. After all, that is what is logical, and that is what we should be doing at long last.
Our next speaker is Madame Marina Messure.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. In our criminal code, there is a crime of failing to assist people in danger, and this is based on a moral and ethical right. People should be protected. But there is no such right in European law, and yet it is so important. At the moment, half of our population is living in a situation of some kind of deprivation. All too many of them can't switch on their heating. They can't make ends meet on a monthly basis. They can't eat in the way that they should. Some of them can't eat at all. And after all, we are one of the prime economies in the global market. Therefore, we need to act as rapidly as possible in order to support the vulnerable, in order to support the associations which are helping vulnerable and deprived communities to do something about the energy tariffs at home for homes. And we've also got to do something about abandoning austerity, introducing windfall taxes, and making sure that all the other numerous solutions that we could implement are finally actually seeing the light of day. Thank you.
Mr. Adam Kosha, please, you have the floor.
The floor is yours, please.
We have a responsibility to make sure that as many of our citizens as possible feel safe and secure. The key to that is decent work. If you have work, you have everything. In Hungary, in 2010, we decided not to go for benefits, but rather to create a society focused on jobs. And in Hungary, we therefore have a work-based economy. Thanks to that, in July 2023, our unemployment rate in Hungary was only 3.9%. Compare that to the EU, where the average was 5.9%. And if you take just the Eurozone, it's 6.4%. Now, the left always argues that the solution lies in benefits, such as the universal minimum wage or income. That's wrong-headed. I actually think that if you want to reduce poverty, you need to create jobs. That is the answer. In Hungary, we have a programme for public works, and thanks to that, we have been able in Hungary to really reduce the risk of poverty and social exclusion compared to others in the EU. I mean, last year, our rate of exclusion was 18.4%, whereas in 2010 it was 30%. Thank you.
Bischof, the floor is yours.
Danke, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner Nicola Schmidt. Well, the problems have been stated, and I think it's quite clear that the statistics don't tell the whole story, that behind the statistics there are human beings, children, women. The issue of unemployment, lack of employment as well, has led to a situation which is totally unbearable. We need a consistent strategy. This situation that exists right now undermines democracy. People have the feeling that they really will not be able to manage because prices are increasing. So this week there was an article of Adam Tusk in the Financial Times referring to the situation in Germany as well, but it's clear it also concerns the entire EU, the extreme right, the growth of the extreme right as well, the lack of housing, the numerous different problems. And of course, if we at the same time, if we speak about foreigners being the cause of the problem, indeed we're not focusing on the real core of the issue, and we will not be able to resolve the issues. Thank you.
Marius.
Colleague Botos.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, colleagues, in the past 4 years, we've seen major challenges and crises that we've never seen before in the EU. Healthcare crisis, the inflation, the energy crisis, and of course, the war in Ukraine. All these changes have impacted our economy and have impacted European citizens who see their revenue dwindling, less job opportunities, and higher prices. We all voted for the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which should have been felt by every citizen, should have benefited every citizen, but this isn't happening yet. More citizens are living in precarious conditions, and many member states are unable to implement the projects and the reforms as they should. It is high time we invest in the European economy, because only a strong economy can help us increase welfare for our European citizens and can help us increase our security as a union.
Herr Kollege. Yes. Mr. Lonka. Michael.
Jest okej? Okay.
Yes, okay.
Pan pochodzi z partii liberalnej. To jest moje pytanie. Chciałem pana po prostu, chciałem poznać pana zdanie.
You're from a liberal party, and I'd like to find out. The speaker has been interrupted.
Oh.
Do you have interpretation? Appears not.
Now it's working? Okay. Please.
Okej. Pochodzi pan z partii liberalnej, bardzo wpływowej.
As I was saying, you're from a liberal party which has enormous influence here in the European Union. In June of this year in Brussels, a think tank generated an article written by a professor who said that the policies of the European Union are extremely expensive, particularly the energy policies, and that creates a very difficult situation for the deprived in society. Don't you see this as a problem? Don't you see this as an issue that, in other words, that the energy policy of the European Union has terrible consequences for the man on the street in Europe?
Yes, dear Conservative colleague, I know you are currently in an election campaign in your country, and you've chosen me as a target, but I think I am the wrong person to be targeted. Yes, I am part of the Renew Europe group, but maybe you are not aware of my convictions and you have not followed my votes. Okay, you were in the middle of your election campaign, but maybe you shouldn't be using the hemicycle to do it.
Frau Katrin Langen-Siepen.
Passt das?
Yeah.
Ja. Sehr geehrter Herr Kommissar,
Thank you. Commissioner, President, colleagues, tackling poverty isn't a new challenge. People in the European Union have been dealing with this for a long time. But what is poverty? Poverty is not being able to eat healthily, not being able to buy any school books, certainly not being able to go to the theatre. And these are all things which you should be able to do if you have a stake in society. We have established a social fund in the European Union, but it's woefully under-resourced. We have a child guarantee scheme, but unfortunately it hasn't been implemented in any member states yet. So for goodness sake, the European Union has got to give itself a reality check. We should actually have some basic insurance. It's not something which we can afford to aspire to. It's something that we've got to achieve. We have got to ensure that the Commission that comes into force with the new into power with the new Parliament actually recognises that forward-looking thinking is finally something that they have to deliver. We can't just have this kind of piecemeal giving people a few crumbs from the table when they're in poverty. We've got to do something constructive to help people out of what is structural poverty rather than simply perpetuating it. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Jadwiga Wiśniewska.
Panie Komisarzu, Szanowni Państwo.
President, ladies and gentlemen, the problem of poverty in the European Union is a particularly important one. I'm of the impression that the groups here representing the left, that they ought to focus on issues which involve real concerns. But what's happening with the left and the far left is that they are not taking responsibility for the consequences of their particular policies. So we have a very restrictive climate policy which has been adopted, which has led to energy poverty in the European Union. I don't know if you're aware of this fact. That, in other words, these are the problems. This is what the core of the issue is. With the law and justice government in Poland, we've had a 148% increase in the minimum wage, and the poverty level in Poland is one of the lowest in the European Union. We have great development, and things are moving forward in Poland on that front. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, Commissioner, thank you very much for calling me to the floor. I'm not going to repeat what previous speakers have said already. On the European labour market, the most vulnerable, the most poor, are the Roma. In Hungary, we have been able to improve employment rates for the Roma community. There's discrimination in the workplace, of course, there's lack of vocational training, in addition to which, compared to their qualifications, these poorest people get the worst jobs. Now, a member of the Roma community who is poor may be able to cope with all of these challenges, but still they have to face all sorts of other problems: black work, the gig economy, so short-term precarious work, poor working conditions. And in the long run, for instance, if you're working on the black market, it means that you are deprived of your pension at the end of your career. Look at what's been happening to those people who have been cleaning our streets over the last 4 decades, building our nations over the last 4 decades. Look at what happens to them at the end of their career. Now, in the Hungarian presidency of 2011, we adopted a Roma strategy, and initiatives were taken in order to try to provide more jobs to members of the Roma community. But it's important for the Commission not to do the opposite. Please don't take the funds away from these poorest people. We need to make sure that we have equal proportion and equality and fairness for all member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Milan Brglec.
Thank you, President. Distinguished Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Precarious work means precarious life. We should not permit that non-standard forms of employment becomes a new normal. New non-standard forms of employment are insecure, they're poorly paid, they do not provide social security or working conditions. And precariousness is caused by a succession of crises, poor management of risks, and also the fiscal rules following the pandemic. And young and women are especially affected. Increasing aid to the most deprived from the European Fund is the least we can do. We need to address the consequences and the causes of precarious work together. I therefore again call for the creation of quality jobs and for the rigorous implementation of labour rights for all workers. Fighting precarious work also means fighting its effects on mental health. So we need a European directive on a minimum income that enables decent living. We also need a European unemployment insurance scheme and a European care guarantee. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Max Orwell.
Monsieur le Commissaire, Monsieur le Président.
Commissioner, President, colleagues. Our social model is a promise which we make to all European unions. In 2023, it is absolutely wrong that we should be seeing worse exclusion and people living in a more precarious way than they were. People shouldn't be suffering from hunger and thirst or living in shame, suffering from escalating housing and heating costs, and the impact, of course, is worst on the least well off. We need to take urgent measures because the degree of vulnerability of our communities is increasing. We need more financial resources, more support for food distribution. We need to restore the links that there are which should bind society together and communities together so that people can live in dignity. It is so important that we ensure that we have adequate and good social housing throughout Europe so that people have access to quality services of housing and education so that we can actually have a more social inclusion and a better mixed societies. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Beata Mazurek.
Szanowni Państwo, prawie 1/3 Europejczyków.
Colleagues, 1 in 3 Europeans said that they consider themselves to be in a financial and material situation which is not adequate. The European Barometer, or the statistics that have been issued this year, have shown that as well. 48% of citizens, in other words, almost half of the citizens, feel that they are at risk. Material issues are extremely serious. The news is not good, and that's why we would like to request from the European Commission that they make more robust solidarity mechanisms which will help people provide health care services to those in need. This has to be done at the European Union level. In Poland, my group has implemented a support policy where you can see very, very clearly how food has been distributed, support has been distributed as well, and tax breaks have been provided to the most deprived in society as well. Citizens are not going to be interested in debates and hot air. They need to be able to live in dignity. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Commissaire.
President, Commissioner, today in Europe, 35% of citizens find it hard to make ends meet. More than 1 European out of 10 lives below the breadline. The figures for vulnerability are on the increase. The economic recovery after the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, inflation, all of them have contributed to skyrocketing prices. To feed oneself, take care of oneself, house oneself, look after your children, these are vital needs, but too many European households have to make a choice. That's unacceptable. There's the working classes that are vulnerable and increasingly also parts of the middle classes, in addition to which the most wealthy are proving very selfish. This is threatening our cohesion in Europe. We cannot turn a blind eye. We cannot remain deaf to this vulnerability. The only European response that is acceptable to all of this, colleagues, is solidarity.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Rondinelli. Thank you very much indeed. Commissioner, colleagues, this week I met with some young people from my region and we were talking about the impact that poverty had in accessing work. And the debate we're having here isn't really recognising this at all, whereas, and is simply turning a blind eye to it. 6 million Italians who are living in abject poverty because of escalating record inflation are often out of a job. The European Union has got to introduce this directive on minimum wages and ensure that it is enforced so that people have got access to services which they need. Many governments are doing this slowly, but the Italian government is not at all. And this is why our workers have lost 22% of their purchasing power over the last year. So we therefore need an emergency extraordinary policy to tackle poverty. We need the child guarantee, yes, but we need more resources there. We need to change our budget rules so that we can actually invest in social policy without this adding to our deficit. Social justice is paramount. It's not an ideology. It's the tissue that binds a healthy society. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the next speaker is not in the chamber. Therefore, we have 5 speakers who have requested the floor for Catch the Eye. And the first speaker is Alicia Horcella.
Sí, muchas gracias, presidente. Este debate nos...
Thank you very much. This debate allows us to focus on real life, on individuals, and the anxiety, of course, is understandable. Electricity, housing, and so on and so forth are a threat. But there are 2 models, that of the right, based on casino capitalism, and the social democratic approach, which is one based on solidarity. We want the present and future of women, children, all those that are deprived to be able to move forward. And we want to provide policy that will create that feeling of robustness and provide for those that are that have been marginalized. We want for prosperity to be shared by all because, of course, freedom cannot be negotiated, and also that sense of welfare and living in welfare, that cannot be negotiated either. Thank you.
Obrigada, Presidente. Desde setembro do ano passado que estamos de forma permanente a fazer jornadas de trabalho em Portugal, tendo a oportunidade...
Last year, we were working overtime in Portugal. The increase in the cost of living with prices skyrocketing and with these minimum wages, this is what is of great concern to people. Home, living, housing, electricity, heating. Workers are making great sacrifices, whereas others are reaping major profits with this particular situation. Other people are suffering terribly. Education, well, there we need investment. Unfortunately, that isn't there right now. People don't need more statements. They don't need any more propaganda. They need support right now to be able to confront the situation, to be able to manage with their salaries, with their pensions. They need to have gas, electricity, energy at an affordable price, access to telecommunication, homes, housing, education, healthcare, and so forth.
Ms. Miranda.
Presidente, o aumento dos preços provocou que...
Thank you very much, President. Price increases have made it impossible for many people to live. Many people are heroes, in fact, just getting to the end of the month. Commissioner, you just came to Santiago de Compostela, to my country, my region. You know that there we have 50% levels of precariousness. There are thousands and thousands of poor people. There's a lack of stability. And the worst thing is that we have also great inequality amongst young people. I mean, young people who are highly qualified. They've done advanced studies. But what's happening to them? They're emigrating. They're emigrating to Europe. And precariousness also has a female face. It's female, it's young. Single-parent families are in a situation of vulnerability. These are vulnerable classes. Precariousness is the opposite of dignity.
Thank you, Nick Wallace.
1 in 4 Europeans are currently living in a precarious financial situation. This means people skipping meals when they're hungry and not turning on the heat when they're cold. And if you think it's bad in your member state, spare a thought for the workers in Ireland. Ireland is the most expensive country in the EU for household expenditure on goods and services, with prices 46% above the EU average. In terms of gross market income, Ireland is the most unequal country in the EU. Ireland's top 20% of earners earn 15 times more than the bottom 20%, according to Eurostat data. We are repeatedly told by governments and the mainstream media that pay rises lead to more inflation. But there is no law that says pay rises need to be passed on to consumers in the form of price rises. Price increases so that profits can be maintained. Prices increase so that capital increases. Inflation is a function of unequal power relations and is the very essence of capitalism.
Wir beenden das Catch the Eye mit Frau Deleclerc.
Thank you, Mr. President. They say that you reap what you sow, but the reality is when Europe's elites sow catastrophe, it's the people who always reap it. A recent Ipsos survey revealed that a third of Europeans are currently in a precarious financial situation. That means they can't afford things like food, travel, clothes. It means they're living in poverty or teetering on the brink of it. Nearly half of Europeans say they can't afford to heat their homes, and 40% of parents have said they can't meet the needs of their children. 1 in 3 skip meals so that they can feed their kids. And almost everyone is scared. Everyone. Lives are being consumed by anxiety. 60% of Europeans are worried about an unexpected expense that could tip them over the edge. Now, big business was already savaging people's lives before Europe's powers decided that a permanent war is better than peace. But that decision has made things worse. The people of Europe are paying for this endless war through a cost of living crisis. What's the point in us wringing our hands if we don't join the dots?
Thank you
very much indeed. May I now ask Commissioner Schmidt to reply to the debate.
Geehrter Herr Präsident, well, we like to repeat, and we all agree, that nobody should be left behind. Today, many people, more and more indeed, are left behind. And what they expect now is real solutions. We have to be aware that these solutions can not only come from the European Union. They have to be coherent, as it was repeated, coming partly from the European Union, but also from member states. 3 observations. First, yes, jobs are important. Without job, you will not get out of poverty. But job is not the only way to get out of poverty. We see more than 10%, and probably now much more than 10%, of working poor. That's why not precarious jobs, jobs with a good salary, these are the jobs that bring you out of poverty. And that's why it is important to bring more security, more stability in the job market, but also to have decent wages, good wages. That's why the directive on minimum wage is so important to be implemented, and I would say to be implemented now. The second one is about money. What can we do? I would say first, let's spend now the money which is immediately available. There are billions of funds in the ESF, in other funds which we have mentioned, which can be used to reduce precariousness, which can be used to reduce poverty and inequality. Let's use them. That's up to the member states to accelerate the use of this money in that purpose. 5.3 billion just for the most deprived. I know that this is not enough and will not be enough. But let's take the money now to help those who are in need. And then, yes, we are in midst of a midterm review. We are in midst of a midterm review of the MFF. And Parliament, if I remember well, has a word to say. Please say it. Thank you.
Danke vielmals, Herr Kommissar.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner. With that, the debate on this particular point comes to an end, and we come to the next point on our agenda. And I am very glad and very grateful indeed that all groups have agreed that this particular report that we're going to discuss today will maintain the name of Madame Véronique Trillet-Noir, who passed away